I'll begin our discussion of the scale portion of the audition with a simple piece of advice. Practice your scales every day. Now, that might sound obvious, but years of experience listening to Lions Band auditions and other similar auditions have shown me that this is an area where students' preparation is often lacking. Even those whose etudes are well prepared and even whose sight read well will often falter here. And that's too bad, because not only do the scales constitute a substantial part of your overall score in the audition, but this is the first thing you play. So this is where the judges will form their first impressions about your playing. And besides, this is also the part of the audition whose contents will affect your playing and benefit your playing beyond just simple audition preparation. Practicing scale patterns promotes the development of both technical skill and musical understanding, and should be part of students' practice diet all the time, not just during audition preparation. Now, as you're preparing this, devote extra practice time to the scales that are less familiar. Most of us who play wind instruments had our first playing experiences in bands, and because band music favors flat keys, we tend to be more comfortable in flat keys than in sharp ones. And yet, in this audition, you're called upon to play all 12 major scales and the chromatic scale, and ideally, you will play in such a way that indicates equal proficiency with each scale. In order to achieve this, I recommend devoting more practice time to the scales with which you are less familiar. If you're practicing the scales in the prescribed order for the audition, moving through the circle of fifths, when you do this, go through the entire sequence and then do the sharp key scales a second time, or whichever scales you're less familiar with a second time, maybe even a third time. Most of us prefer to practice things that we're good at. It's more fun to play things that sound good than that sound bad. But growth comes when we spend time improving the things that we don't play so well. Spending more time on the scales that you are less familiar with will promote that kind of growth and enable you to demonstrate something closer to equal command in all keys during the audition. Third, let's discuss range. Play as many octaves as you can on the scales, but do not take unnecessary risks. The scoring in the scale portion of the audition is such that additional octaves are rewarded to a point, but only if they are played well. The scales in this audition are not scored individually. There's just an aggregate score assigned to this portion of the audition as a whole. So that means that there's not like 1 point per scale or 2 points per scale or something like that. There's just an aggregate score that is assigned to that part of the audition. And moreover, there's no specific mechanism for awarding extra points for added octaves. There's just an expectation that students will demonstrate an appropriately complete tonal range. Now, to my mind, if each major scale is played at least 2 octaves, and the chromatic scale is played at least 2.5 octaves, then that requirement is satisfied. Third or even fourth octaves, if played well, will end up adding in some way to the score, as judges will inevitably award more points to those who exceed the minimal expectations. But additional octaves played poorly will only add missed notes, and the loss to your score as a result might be even greater than the benefit would have been if you played them well. So with this in mind, and keeping in mind also that you only have 3 minutes for this portion of the audition, if you are going to add extra octaves, do so only on those scales where you know you can do it well. You'll probably have time to play the additional octaves on no more than half of the major scales. Let me also suggest that you avoid playing extra low octaves on the scales that include a low concert B. That note is missing on the tenor trombone with only 1 valve. It's missing on the non-compensating euphonium, and it's missing on the non-compensating B-flat tuba with only 4 valves. That means that the low octaves on, say, the concert G or concert A scales are out of bounds, even if you can play those pedal tones. Now, of course, if you have a compensating euphonium or a C tuba or a B flat tuba that's configured to have that low B working, then by all means go for it. Set aggressive but reasonable tempos. There's no prescribed tempo for the scale portion of this audition, except that you'll need to play fast enough to complete the scales within the 3-minute time limit. On the scale demonstration videos in this channel, I've provided 3 examples of how to play the scale portion of the audition on each instrument. These are representative examples only that illustrate how students of different ability levels might successfully approach the scales in this audition. You will want to craft an approach to the scales that best showcases your particular abilities. If you are thinking of the scales written in quarter and eighth notes, the slower example in my videos is played with the half note at 60 beats a minute or the quarter note at 120 beats a minute. The major scales are all played 2 octaves and the chromatic scale 2.5 octaves. That is not a particularly aggressive speed, but if that is how fast you can play beautifully and cleanly and you're not going for extra octaves, you'll be able to play a credible audition that way. It would certainly be preferable to going faster than you can play well and having the wheels come off, as it were. The medium example on the videos is played with the half note at 72 beats a minute or the quarter note at 144 beats a minute. Here I play 3 of the major scales 3 octaves and the chromatic scale 3 octaves. This is probably closer to the speed most students will want to pursue, and the faster tempo here leaves some extra time just in case you need to recover from an error or perhaps want to add an extra octave someplace. The fastest example on these videos is played with the half note at 84 beats a minute or the quarter note at 168 beats per minute, with 6 of the major scales played 3 octaves and a 3-octave chromatic scale. This is a particularly aggressive approach, probably faster than most students will want to try, but it is possible. At this tempo, there's quite a bit of time left over, even with the extra octaves. So if you wanted to try to add a 4th octave someplace, that would be possible. And again, even though you hope this doesn't happen, when you go faster and you have some cushion, then you have some room if you need to repeat something for error correction. Again, choose a tempo and a number of octaves for each scale that you can play well. In the end, you will achieve your best score when you choose a speed and number of octaves that show you at your best. Higher and faster, but with lots of mistakes, is not a pathway to success. 5th, play with the best tone quality you possibly can. A common disappointment, at least for me, listening to the scale portion of the audition, is that some students will play with a poor tone quality. Sometimes even people who play the etudes with a nice sound or sight read with a nice sound seem to neglect this on the scales in favor of just hitting the notes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the scales are the first things played in the audition, so this is where the judges will form their first impressions about each student. You don't want that first impression to be, this kid has a bad sound. In the end, what everybody wants to hear all the time on everything you play is a beautiful sound. It doesn't matter how high or fast you can play if the tone quality is poor. And besides, you will find that embouchure response and note accuracy are best when you play with your best sound. Ironically, a focus on merely hitting the notes usually does not yield the desired result. If you want to play accurately, play beautifully. A related idea is that you need to play in tune all the time. Intonation is an important aspect of effective scale performance that is sometimes overlooked. Now, euphonium and tuba players have somewhat less challenge here than trombonists do. As long as you have a good tone quality and correct fingerings, chances are your pitch will be pretty good, but do be aware that some instruments have intonation quirks on particular notes. If you notice something like that with your particular instrument, it might be best to find alternate fingerings in those places. Remember too that the seventh partial should be avoided entirely on euphonium and tuba. If you're playing the high concert A flat, G, and F sharp open second and first valve respectively, stop doing that. The notes are very flat using those fingerings. Play concert A flat first valve, G 1 and 2, and F sharp 2 and 3. For trombones, intonation is more of a challenge because the slide can enable both very good intonation or very poor intonation. There are lots of small adjustments that advanced players will make to really dial in the intonation. The overtone series charts at the website on the top right of your screen can provide a guide to this. But let me briefly go over the most important changes that you'll need to make with the slide positions to correct pitch. First, if you are using the F attachment, the slide positions must be extended. There is more to playing valve register notes correctly than simply pressing the lever. All of the positions except first are longer than they are without the valve, and the difference between the regular positions and the valve positions becomes greater as you go down the slide. These adjustments are absolutely necessary for correct intonation when the valve is in use. The other important one to mention is the seventh partial, the one that I just said is unusable on the euphonium and tuba. The high G and G flat in second and third positions must be in a very short second and third position in order to be in tune. Using a regular position will sound extremely flat. For the same reason, the high A flat in first position is unusable. Yet I have seen lots of trombone players trying to use it in the Lions Band audition. It is too flat to be used, and there is no way to correct it by bringing in the slide in first position. Play that note in third position. And there are tons of other smaller intonation adjustments, again, that you can make. But these are the most important ones. If you want further help with this, again, the overtone series charts on my website are a place to start. And this is also one reason why private lessons are particularly necessary and helpful. Seventh, give tongued notes their full value. With regard to articulation, most students will tongue while ascending and slur, or for trombones use a legato tonguing technique, while descending. This is fine, but keep in mind that while the ascending scales are normally tongued, there's no expectation that they be short. In fact, you will find that your tone, accuracy, and response will be best if you think of giving the tongued notes their full value. You might even think of using a tenuto articulation when ascending and then slurred or legato while descending. That will go a long way toward playing those beautiful sounding scales I mentioned a moment ago. With the descending scales, blow a constant airstream to make slurring or legato tonguing sound its best. One of my pet peeves in trombone and low brass pedagogy is that we tend to teach slurring for euphonium and tuba and legato tonguing for trombone in an incomplete way. To slur, valve instrument players are simply told, don't tongue. And for legato, trombonists are told to tongue softly. Now these instructions are correct as far as they go, but they are incomplete. In both slurring and legato tonguing, we are looking for the notes to be connected, for the end of one note to go all the way to the beginning of the next. The expectation then is for constant sound, which only occurs when there is a constant buzz in the mouthpiece, and that only occurs when there is constant airflow. Think of blowing constant air through the descending scales, and at any time when you want a slurred or legato articulation. That will give you the desired sound, and trombonists in particular will find that legato tonguing is a lot easier to figure out once this often missing piece of the puzzle is in place. With regard to the chromatic scale, I think you should pause at every octave, just like you do with the major scales. If you watch and listen to the scale demonstration videos in this channel, you'll notice that that's exactly what I do. During the chromatic scales, I stop every octave, and during the 2.5 octave version, I stop after the first half octave. I have a hard time understanding why most people don't do this, and I didn't even do it when I was auditioning for the Lions Band over 20 years ago. But think about it. We pause every octave in the major scales, and this provides convenient places to breathe and also promotes mental organization so we don't get lost in an endless stream of notes. So building pauses into the chromatic scale in this way does the same thing. It makes the breathing well-timed and less awkward and helps you to keep up with where you are. It just makes sense. Finally, don't underestimate the importance of this part of the audition. So let me end by reiterating something that I said at the beginning of this video. The scales are the first thing you play in this audition. Yet judging by the performances I've heard over the years, it seems that some students don't take this part very seriously, or they take it for granted. Don't do this. Playing scales well is challenging and requires diligent preparation, especially if you want to develop the equal command in all keys and beautiful tone quality we've discussed. And again, this is where the judges will form their first impressions about your playing. Make sure your first impression is a good one.